Hello, I'm Vanja Škorić.
And I'm Giovanni Sileno.
We are from the University of Amsterdam, Social Intelligent Artificial Systems Group. And together with Senay Gebrab, we prepared a paper on legality, legitimacy, and instrumental possibility in human and computational governance for the public sector. When using artificial intelligence in public service, we should always ask, is such a use legitimate, legal, trustworthy, fair, accountable? And to answer that, we should identify some crucial architectural requirements at both normative and computational level. So essentially, this means addressing both legality and legitimacy of AI use, along with the important third dimension, which is the instrumental possibility. It concerns enabling of normative and computational interventions. We argue that only against that backdrop, we can fully unpack what is legal, legitimate, trustworthy, fair, and accountable approach in designing and implementing AI for public service. Next slide.
Let's dive a little bit more into these three concepts, so legality, legitimacy, and instrumental possibility. Let's start from the traditional positivistic view on law. So according to which, if something is formally legal, then it is legitimate. That assumes that when the policymaker, the lawmaker, decided there's a certain law, certain rights, that was about protecting certain legitimate concern. But we have also another way of looking at legitimacy is that there may be people that have legitimate concern that are protected, for instance, by other levels of law, like international law, human rights, that may raise arguments against what are the current law in place. So we have these two different views of a legitimacy. So if it is formally legal, then it is illegitimate. Then legitimacy is eventually what drives what the law is. But there is the third dimension, as Vanya was saying, which is instrumental possibility. We both need this feedback or this interaction to work. We need some instrument to make it possible, so that what is written into the law actually protecting the interest of someone. On the other hand, if there is some problem, then these legitimate concerns are modifying what the law means.
So let's unpack this a little bit further. In practical terms, from the human side, we examine what are the minimal legality and legitimacy requirements for a meaningful governance structure. And from the computational side, we elaborate on what are the infrastructural components required to regulate algorithms in alignment with the directives provided by humans. Now, the challenge is how to set up at the design phase a continuous development and integration of both parts. How to adapt the behavior of the computational system to really dynamic contexts that are evolving AI. And all of this is motivated to attain AI benefits and mitigate risks and harms. Now, currently, the absence of fully developed normative frameworks in the public sector, and especially for safeguarding human rights part, presents a gap. And in parallel, there are discussions about the need how to increase legitimacy of the use of AI. So the goal here really is to set the minimal legality and legitimacy requirements. And one avenue we trace is democracy by design, in line with the ideas that are already out there on value-sensitive design and frameworks for privacy by design. Next slide. We examine actually how to ensure that AI system is effective for its purpose, but also able to safeguard human rights, ensuring all the values of democracy and participation. So in this slide, we can see how these different layers interplay. If we examine what the adequate normative framework for AI should be, ideally it would guide and structure the whole AI lifecycle with aim to establish appropriate legality, legitimacy, and accountability aspects. How to fill the existing gap? We argue that the architecture of governance for AI systems should start from a general but very, very clear normative framework. And also it should translate this framework in a social arrangement by engaging with different private and diverse public sectors, as well as potentially with all of the affected communities. So in this structure, essentially what we say is this is a multi-layered governance effort, an interplay of international norms and regulation, national regulation as well, concrete technical standards, framework for guidance, clear oversight and monitoring mechanisms, and finally, the spaces for civic engagement. Next slide, please. So where do legality and legitimacy actually fit in this framework? They are the part of the benchmarks for AI governance, really a part of making the informative choices in AI design and development. And what drives these design choices? Well, we argue that a broadly accepted international human rights framework can be a benchmark for values and protections in design choices. So if we start from that human rights framework and its case law, especially regarding the balancing of different design choices and rights and weighing different options and competing interests, we can translate the existing three-part test from international human rights law and repurpose it in the AI design context. For example, we can test and ask, is the intended purpose of AI actually allowed or legal? If yes, is this particular AI system effective in achieving its intended purpose for the public use? And if yes, is it really then proportionate and necessary for this use, considering all of its human rights impacts? Next slide. And you can see all of these questions correspond to different contexts and aspects. The first one on legality aspect, the second one on the internal legitimacy aspect, and the third one on external legitimacy aspect. And next slide. To address the three-part test at the architectural level, we then need to consider three fundamental dimensions: the scope, the process, and the participants. On the scope dimension, the concern is what criteria and indicators are there available to lead and motivate the assessment. In our framing, this is the human rights framework and human rights criteria. They need to be operationalized depending on the context of the AI development and use. On the process dimension, we can see three different aspects here. First, to specify how the criteria and indicators are actually measured. So that's the assessment process itself. But also important is the procedural level in terms of governance. So how to specify the assessment process in procedural aspects. So this is the assessment policy process. And then also how to determine whether the assessment was performed correctly. So that's the assessment oversight process. And we need clear standards for all three levels of the process. And finally, all of these processes activate specific different stakeholders and participants and require multidisciplinary actions with diverse expertise and experience. A final concern is, of course, oversight of the assessment outcomes and the use of AI. And here also we need to have open channels for the public and impacted groups to actually raise concerns about potential risks and harms as participants.
Now let's go on the computational governance component. As we say, that our goal here is to find what are the infrastructural components to regulate algorithms in alignment with what we have decided just before on the human governance side. But because even if we set up an adequate governance structure on the human side of the process, we cannot guarantee that the computational side is going to adapt accordingly. So the question is here, what is needed in terms of from a technological point of view for enabling forms of continuous governance? So from what is known in the fields like business IT alignment or even in the administrative studies, there are systematic misalignment in policy in IT context, because typically the design level is requested to encode algorithms in algorithms requirements that are set up by the policy level, and the user level is constrained by the tools that are provided by design level. So there is a full passage of enabling across the three levels of activity. And finally, we have also to take into account, and because of someone is using this application, then it will have some impact to a more general type of public. So this provides us all the ecology, if you want, of the stakeholders that are involved into a process of use of AI. But then we can observe that typically the design and policy level are not adequately aware of the problems that are observed at the user side, and even less from the public level point of view. And user publics, they don't have the power to modify the functioning of the system, because they have always to pass through the developer in order to do that. So indeed, the main idea that is developed in this last period is to have like panels, committees that are made up of people that are engaging all these different types of stakeholders. But still, in this case, even in this case, the update time is very long, because you need to organize all the stakeholders, you need the developer put that into practice. If there are problems, then there needs refinement. Overall, the process looks like to be so long that risks to be ineffective, even if it starts with the best intent. So the problem that we want to raise also from the computational side of the story is that legality and legitimacy are not enough. We can also do that all well on paper, but still, if we are not tackling down the problem of instrumental possibility, its effectivity, we cannot say that we have solved the issue. So what we are asking for is to have computational governance structure to match the human governance structure. And that means that the key technology that we require is something that allows us to design and configure intervention points within the system. So that means that both users, public, policy, they can intervene at different points in different time on the design and the code process, or how the system functions. And that would allow us to disengage from the committee mechanism, from the panel mechanism. And that calls for an operationalization of dimension of normative system, which is not the standard view over this problem from a computational point of view. So we're not looking for generic type way of programming. We're not looking at the only concepts like obligation, prohibition, but power constructs become the most central component, because what we are doing is to assign power constructs to different parties that are able to modify components into the system. So to conclude, our paper has two components, but they are intertwined. So democratic principles needs to be operationalized within a sound governance architecture, which is based upon the human rights framework. And we identified core design elements for that. So the 3 parts test, the scope, process, and participant architectural dimension for AI systems in public use. And we observed that this is necessary, required in order to have both legality and legitimacy dimension to be considered. Additionally, we observed that we are still lacking adequate technologies that support a kind of continuous alignment between human and computational realms. So we argued that instrumental possibility cannot be separated from discussions on legality and legitimacy. So to have a proper governance, we need also functioning power constructs in the computational realm. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.